After graduating high school, I moved in with my older brother for roughly 4 years. Since we were both unable to afford a place to live on our own, we decided to split the rent on an apartment. In the 4th year, however, my brother's financial situation improved, and he decided to vacate the premises at the end of the lease due to my low income. I was aware that I could not afford to cover the entire cost of the apartment by myself. After months of searching online for a roommate, I ultimately decided to just leave and find a more affordable place to live myself. I continued my lookups through the last month of our lease. My brother had already moved most of his stuff out, so I was under a lot of pressure to quickly find a new place to live despite my extremely limited financial resources. However, I was able to find a room in a house through a listing posted by a homeowner. Evan was the name of the guy. I let him know via text that I was considering him for the job and kept looking. Minutes later, he finally got back to me. We decided to talk later in the day, and he filled us in on everything. I was told he lived there alone and was renting out a spare bedroom, but that I was welcome to use any of the other rooms. I thought it was a great idea, so I agreed to it, and then 2 weeks later I loaded up a U-Haul and headed for the house. We'd been in touch via text and phone call, and he'd sent over a dozen photos of the house, but I still hadn't seen it in person. I pulled into the driveway at around noon. The home was tiny by any measure, but it presented well from the street. In the garage, I saw Evan standing and waving me over. After showing me around, he assisted me in bringing my belongings up to my room. Evan struck me as a normal man in his mid-30s. He was nearly 10 years older than me, but I didn't mind. However, he was awkward in social situations and had trouble carrying on conversations. We finally got everything unloaded inside, and I left the U-Haul there. It was almost 8 o'clock by the time I awoke and limped back to the house. While Evan was relaxing on the couch in front of the television, I excused myself and went to my room. Overall, I was satisfied. The town seemed fine. By the time I had finished unpacking and made my bed at 9 o'clock, I was ready for bed. I went to close my door and turn off the lights, but when I went to turn the knob, I realized there was no lock. I fumbled for the doorknob in my daze. The door's lock was visible from the outside. The bedroom door was locked from the outside, so I went into the living room to ask Evan. He blinked in surprise and promised to make the change the following day. I shrugged, said okay, and retreated to my room. It was a strange discovery, but I wasn't too concerned because I was exhausted. The moment I hit the sack, I was out. I awoke in the wee hours of the morning. I reclosed my eyes after hearing a noise in the kitchen, which I attributed to Evan getting more water. I heard him return to the hallway a minute later, but he paused right outside my door. The door opened and I looked out. He had been standing outside for about 15 seconds when I heard the click that told me he had locked my door. As Evan descended the stairs to his room, my stomach sank and my face grew cold. When I heard the door to his bedroom close, I sneaked out of bed and went to check on him. I attempted to turn the handle but was unable to do so. For a few seconds, I just stood there, processing the fact that this man I had just met had just locked me in a room. My apprehension had begun to morph into rage. When I heard Evan approaching, I yelled for him to unlock the door. It didn't take long for me to hear Evan sprint from his room to mine. I could tell he was about to unlock the door when he paused for a moment. Immediately, I swung open the door. What the heck was that? I spoke my mind to him. Evan, stumbling over his words, said he was just checking in to make sure he was okay since he didn't recognize me. I could see why you'd be worried, but locking someone in a room wouldn't be the best way to handle the situation. I told him I was going to leave the next day and waited on the living room couch all night for the U-Haul store to open. I peeped out into the hall at 9 o'clock and saw that Evan's bedroom door was still closed, so I took that as a good sign that he was still in bed. I got there quickly and brought the U-Haul back home. However, when I got inside, I found that Evan's room door was propped open. Evan, I put in a shout. I went and stuck my head in his room. Nothing was in his room. My bewildered gaze swept the room. The strangeness continued, so I changed my mind and quickly packed up my belongings. I spent 2 hours without stopping packing and disassembling my bed. 2 boxes were the last ones I had. I grabbed another and ran back outside, waiting by the front door for Evan to appear. "Move," I commanded. He just looked at me coldly. He waited for a moment, then moved out of the way. I pushed the box past him and loaded it into the U-Haul. The final box only held about half of the random food items I had saved from my old apartment's pantry. I just decided to abandon the idea. I needed to get away from Evan as soon as possible. He was giving me the creeps. I had gotten the back of the U-Haul closed when Evan barged in. Holding up the final container, he said, "You forgot this. We appreciate it." When he reached for it, I snatched it away and jumped back into the truck. As I stacked the box, I could feel his eyes on me. When I looked up, he was at the door. He began to close in on me by pulling it down. Before the door even started to lower, I managed to stop him. I pushed him down, but he got up and ran, not inside the house but into the trees outside. Not only was I confused, but I also didn't give a hoot. After quickly locking the rear door, I left. It was very kind of my brother to let me stay with him while I looked for a new place to call home. There was something very wrong going on at that house, but I have no idea what happened or what would have happened if I had been there. Last year, during the colder months, I relocated to my new home. My first house was a beautiful, roomy place with a sizable yard. However, I had to move everything by myself, which was a bit of a hassle because I was living alone. Early that morning, I arrived with the truck, shoveled the snow off the driveway, and then began bringing in the boxes and furniture. I was done right before dinner time, which is pretty late. After securing the truck, I headed back outside to await the morning's delivery. After that, I don't think I did much more than watch something on my phone. My bed wasn't ready, so I slept on the couch in the living room. The couch wasn't the most inviting, but as I lay there trying to nod off, I became aware of a peculiar sound emanating from beyond the door. There was the sound of footsteps approaching my front door. I sat bolt upright and peered over at the entranceway as I listened intently. However, the noise abruptly ceased as they neared the entrance. For what seemed like an eternity, I finally fell asleep, convinced that I must just be hearing things. The front door was unlocked when I woke up this morning. I was positive I'd secured it before going to sleep. I looked around outside for footprints, but there were none. After returning the truck, I devoted the rest of the day to unloading and arranging the remaining pieces of furniture. By the end of the day, I had completed most of my tasks. My evening out began at 6 and I returned home at 7. However, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd in the snow. There was a trail of footprints in the snow that ended at my front door. After searching high and low, I finally located the source of the footprints, which led to the sidewalk that had been cleared. I tried to reassure myself that it was probably just a friendly neighbor dropping by to say hello. Before going to bed, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked and secured. As I approached the front door, I saw that it had been left unlocked. I went ahead and tested the lock to make sure it required the key to open, and sure enough, it worked as expected. Every time I left the room during the day, I made sure the door was locked. Still, I couldn't fathom what was causing this. There were no signs of a break-in, and no items were missing from the home. If anyone had entered, they would have tracked in the snow and rain and left wet footprints all over the place. I double-checked the lock and headed up to my room for a quick shower before turning in. However, I heard something downstairs as I was exiting the bathroom after my shower. Indistinguishable subtlety. Although I would normally just assume it was nothing, I felt compelled to double-check this time around. Slowly, I dressed and made my way downstairs. As I rounded the landing at the top of the stairs, I saw a man standing in the hall. The front door was open behind him as he turned to face me. For some reason, I just stood there, paralyzed by shock. After pausing for a second, I bolted back up the stairs and into my bedroom. Even though I couldn't hear him, I was still very afraid. Then I heard movement in the basement rooms. As the man downstairs kept strolling around, I decided to dial 911. Maybe 2 minutes later, I heard the front door slam and the footsteps disappear. The police had nothing useful to report and instead suggested installing surveillance cameras and replacing the door locks. I completed both tasks, but the man never returned. Almost. I hope he does so I can catch him on camera, because now it feels like every day is spent nervously anticipating his return. I don't know what he was up to or why, but I certainly hope I never find out. In the weeks that followed, I was plagued by persistent anxiety and suspicion. My spine tingled at every sound from the hallway or outside. I started checking the locks and windows several times a day to make sure nobody could get in. As my mind raced with images of the intruder's return, sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. In response to police recommendations, I have installed cameras in and around my home. The presence of the cameras gave me some peace of mind, but it wasn't enough to completely dispel the anxiety I felt. There was still a palpable sense of unease in the air, despite the heightened security, even though it was my own house, the place where I was supposed to find solace. I was unable to do so, to the point where I questioned whether or not it would be better to have a roommate or pet to feel more secure in my living situation. When I told my loved ones about my terrifying encounter, they strongly suggested that I relocate to a new area, if not a new city entirely. Despite my best efforts to convince myself otherwise, I was reluctant to leave the lovely home in which I had made so many sacrifices. My professional and social obligations were both rooted here, which further complicated matters. As the weeks turned into months, people's anxieties started to lessen. There was no evidence of the intruder's return on the surveillance footage, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. My life eventually returned to a more regular pattern, and I found solace in my daily rituals. Nonetheless, the incident had left its mark on me despite my more composed outward demeanor. I started being much more careful and watchful in every facet of my life. I enrolled in self-defense classes and started paying closer attention to my environment whenever I was out and about. I learned from this experience to put my safety first. The memories of that terrifying night gradually receded into the background as time passed. Though I'll never forget the lessons it taught me, I eventually felt safe again in my own home. As time went on, I grew to enjoy the simple pleasures and satisfaction that came with being a homeowner. To avoid dwelling on my worries, I engaged in a wide variety of activities, and I reached out to loved ones whenever I felt the need to talk things out. I refused to let the sadness and uncertainty of that one night overshadow the joy and possibility that my new home represented to me. Although it was challenging, I was eventually able to reclaim my sense of calm and my house as a haven. I've learned to trust my gut and take sensible safety measures without letting fear rule my life as a result of that terrifying experience. I still exercise caution, but I no longer let the events of that night control my life or the level of joy I experience. Uncertainty and danger are inevitable in life, but I've learned that perseverance and bravery can bring us back to a place of safety and strength. Onto a brand spanking new home on the other side of the state. My former landlord wanted to sell the house, so he terminated my lease when it expired and evicted me. I was so thrilled about this new home that I decided to lease it. However, within the first few days of moving in, I became aware that my new next-door neighbor was staring at me on multiple occasions. He was in his 40s but never seemed to leave the house. The more I saw him, the more I realized there was something off about him. But at first I tried to brush it off as simple curiosity about the new person in the neighborhood. He was always there, never left, and never interacted with anyone. He did nothing but observe from his home. At all hours of the night, I could see him standing in his driveway and occasionally catch a glimpse of him through my window. It was becoming unsettling to me. As I was getting ready for bed one night, I was startled awake by a sound from the street. The noise sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I looked out my window and saw my neighbor dragging what appeared to be a very tall ladder across his yard. It was late, and I couldn't imagine a scenario in which he needed to do housework at that hour. I tried to convince myself that my suspicions about my neighbor were just the result of being in an unfamiliar place with strange people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a while of trying to relax, I was able to get some shut-eye. I ran into him again the following morning. This time, he was outside my window at the end of my driveway. I closed the curtain and ignored him, but knowing that he was there gave me the creeps. I was also unnerved by his proximity to my driveway and consequently hurriedly made my way to the car. Even though he was back in his yard, he followed my car as I left. From here on out, things got a lot worse. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the grass in my backyard, which was enclosed by a fence. I got up to check the window, but the sound of approaching feet had stopped. I lay in bed for what felt like half an hour, but no one came back in. Just to be sure, I got up and looked out the window again, and there was a person standing way in the yard's back corner. It was dark, so I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew someone was watching me from a distance. I retreated and dialed 911, but the man was already gone. I filled them in on my suspicious neighbor, but they said there was no cause for alarm because he had never been arrested before. Unless something much more serious occurred, I was on my own. I began to take safety measures such as closing and locking all windows and doors and limiting my time spent outdoors. I didn't feel any safer, even after that. I'd been in the new place for nearly 2 weeks at this point, and I was seriously considering terminating the lease. Then an event occurred. When I finally made it home from the office, I promptly collapsed into bed. But in the middle of the night, I heard a thud against the house's side, and I jumped out of bed to investigate. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and it sounded like it was right up against the wall outside. My heart pounding, I drew back the curtains and slowly got out of bed. When I looked out the window and saw my neighbor's face staring at me, I jumped back and yelled. To peer into my room, he had climbed a ladder. He jumped down and fled quickly. After another call to the police, they quickly apprehended him while he was attempting to bring the ladder to the ground. He didn't come right out and admit it, but it was clear what he was up to. One of my neighbors stopped by in the days that followed to share that they, too, had some strange interactions with the neighbor guy, and they claimed he was peering into their homes through open windows one day when they returned from work. I can't help but wonder if they'd reported the guy if they'd known what was going to happen to me, but at least it's over now.